All right, my friends, welcome to today's episode where I want to talk about the OCD and anxiety loop. And I want to talk about really the four components that make up that loop. So, when we begin to understand this idea of recontextualizing that it's not a feeling necessarily that we're trying to overcome or heal or get rid of, it's more that we are caught in a loop that is self perpetuating. It's a completely different recontextualization of the problem. Most people, when they're dealing with anything related to anxiety, perceive the feeling of anxiety as the problem, or they project the anxiety onto some external cause or idea, and that's what they perceive to be the problem, not realizing that fear itself is self-perpetuating. So when I talk about this loop, understand that it applies to really all the variations of what we would call anxiety disorders. So all the way from general anxiety to social anxiety to phobias to OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder to PTSD and derealization and panic attacks, right? The higher forms. Understand that it's just a fear spectrum, right? It's an anxiety spectrum. And there's, very mild to very extreme, sensations that can go within that one particular spectrum. And this happens for all the different emotions, right? When you talk about anger, you can be like mildly irritated about getting an email to full of rage, where you almost like are out of control of yourself. That's still a spectrum of anger, right? And when we're talking about fear, understand that fear exists on this continuum. And what happens with fear is that it becomes self-perpetuating. And what I mean by that is the more you feel fear, the more you have beliefs that are fearful or, limiting or, even victim oriented, the more you're going to have those kind of thought patterns. And then the more you're going to experience the, secondary emotions of anxiety and, concern, like all the uncertainty, right? All of that stuff, right? And then you're going to engage in the safety behaviors or the compulsions that then, provide some level of relief or escape, only to reinforce the initial fear. And so the cycle self perpetuates. So the problem that I find most people really get stuck in is this idea that they're in this loop, this self perpetuating loop, without really being conscious and aware that they're in the loop to begin with. And they misperceive the problem as a thought or feeling problem or a content problem, or even as far as going to say a compulsion problem. And if you don't understand the four components of the loop and you aren't working at it from this context, it's radically difficult to break out of it. And even if you do break out of it, you're more than likely to fall back into it, because if you have unconscious competence at something, if you don't understand why you're successful at it, you're not going to be able to repeat, why you were successful to begin with, right? It's like, someone who, for instance, let's say someone picked a random stock or crypto coin to put their money in, and all of a sudden it exploded and they have no idea why. It's like, yeah, that person made a great investment, but they're unlikely to be able to repeat that because it was just kind of like, it could have been luck or, whatever it was that provoked them to do it in the beginning. So understanding the four components of this loop helps you to understand why and how this loop forms. And if you understand why and how the loop forms to begin with, then you begin to understand what you need to do to dismantle it. Because the loop is not a disorder. Being stuck in the loop is what creates disorder in your life. Feeling emotion and having underlying beliefs that lead to fear, right? Or certain identity structures that lead to the beliefs that lead to fear. This experience of fear, this kind of energy state that we get into, and then we project the fear onto these topics and ideas, and then feel anxiety, and then engage in safety behaviors, and so on and so forth. When you understand the complete picture, you understand that this is something that you can work on multiple levels. But if you're working at it from the wrong perspective, or you're working at the wrong level, and more importantly, if you're doing the wrong intervention altogether, you're not going to dismantle the loop, and it's going to self-perpetuate. And even if you do escape it and you aren't conscious of how you did that, you're very likely to fall back in, which is why most people perpetuate the idea that, OCD anxiety is a chronic condition. You're just going to have it the rest of your life. The perpetuation of that idea is just not something that I agree with. Obviously, it doesn't mean that there aren't people that deal with it their whole lives. Of course, there are, probably millions of people who deal with it and get stuck in that loop and stay in it their whole lives. But there's also people that recover, right? So telling someone that their prognosis is they're going to stay in it, well, yeah, if you keep doing the same things that are perpetuating the loop, it's like, yeah, you're going to stay in it. But you absolutely can dismantle and break the loop. And, that's what I teach people how to do with taking back control, right? It's really understanding the largest context of what's actually happening. And once you understand it, it's learning the skills and strategies and implementing them. And then more importantly, having the support, accountability to really master it. And so the first, obviously, aspect of the loop that most people become aware of are the thoughts, right? And what most people don't understand about thoughts is that there are two really different kind of categories of thoughts. There's your willful thought, right? So you willfully thinking of something, right? Like if you were saying, hey, I want to envision myself on a nice beach vacation, you can create that thought and image in your mind. And then there's the automatic thoughts that just happen, generally as a result of your underlying beliefs, your underlying identities, and your dominant emotional field or your state. So if you have this inherent belief, let's just say, that says, I can't trust the world, I have to provide for myself, right? The world's a dangerous place. Well, that assumption and belief right there is going to be putting you in a state of fear more often than not, because you see life and you see the world as this thing that's happening to you. As a result of that, you're going to experience an undertone or kind of an emotional state of just fear, and you won't even necessarily be aware of, right? And then, more importantly, this fear, right, is going to produce automatic thoughts of that are usually what if oriented, right? Fear generally projects itself into the future. So because if there's nothing causing your fear right now, it's like, well, our mind needs to come up with, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? What about this? And then a certain thought will hit a certain belief system or wound or, what have you. And then you have this emotional reaction, this anxiety, this spike, right? And then we falsely assume that because I had this emotional spike, that was real. That was a real potential threat in the future. It was valid because I felt something. So then because we resist the thought and then we resist the feeling, we then engage in a safety behavior or compulsion that gives us some relief, indirectly validating the initial thought or conditioning ourselves to believe that was an actual danger we need to really be aware of and take into consideration. And then the cycle just begins to fuel. The more thoughts, the more feelings, the more resistance, the more compulsions, the more safety behaviors, and then, it's interchangeable. And then the temporary periods of relief create this self-sustaining loop. The longer and more speed or velocity that loop begins to spin, the more we perceive what we would call disorder to then take over our life, because fear in its very nature is destructive. So we may start engaging in all this time trying to neutralize the thoughts, neutralize the feelings out of resistance. And because we spend so much time doing it, we end up showing up late to work a bunch and lose our job. Or, we're in our minds all the time, so we're not engaging with our spouse and they lose interest in us because they're not really having a relationship with us. They're just kind of like existing while we're in our mind all the time. Right? Or, you fill in the blank, like, we make poor financial decisions, we make poor health decisions, right? It's like, because it's done so in this need to control. And control only comes from fear. It comes from a lack of trust. The only reason you want to control something is because you don't trust the outcome that the outcome will naturally occur favorably or good. So understanding these four components of the loop, and even the underlying components that really make it up to begin with, you begin to understand, like, okay, well, if I'm working at this loop from the content of my thoughts, and what if I get, AIDS, for instance, or if I get, this particular terrible event happens, and I'm treating it as this futuristic event, well, naturally that's going to create the OCD and anxiety loop. And if I feed that and I come up with the next thought and the next thought and the next thought and the next thought, and I'm always responding and reacting and reacting and reacting the same, well, yeah, the loop can go on forever. Of course. Why would it do anything other than that? Because it's essentially it's being self-perpetuated and created again and again and again. This is why we have to look at this correctly contextually, because if you don't, you're bound to fall in the trap again and again and again and again and again. And so becoming aware of the loop is so massive and important for your recovery. And that's why I wanted to take the time today to do this, is because it's like you have to be able to understand this from the right perspective, to understand the strategies and why we're actually doing them, so that you can be successful. So with that said, hope this was helpful. I hope this served you. And yeah, with that, wishing you a great week and a great day. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Hey there, thanks so much for watching that episode. If you found it helpful, we have some links to some other episodes that we think you might like as well. And if you're looking for help on your journey to recovery from fear, stress, and anxiety, either check out the links in the notes or head over to restoredminds.com. Thank you, and talk to you soon.